Right. Hello and welcome, everyone. And my name's Carol, and I'm co-editor with Dr. Anthony Reddie of the forthcoming book, Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. And in these videos, we're going to be hearing from the book contributors about their chapters and some of the issues explored in the book. So today I'm speaking to Michael Jagessar about his chapter, which is entitled Mission and Whiteness, Archival Lessons from LMS in British Guiana. So welcome, Michael. Could you introduce yourself and briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Thank you very much, Carol. So as you said, I am Michael Jagessar. I am now retired. I used to work with the United Reformed Church as a minister, then with Council for World Mission. I taught at Queen's College, and I write a lot of different things. I'm very eclectic. When I'm usually asked to describe myself, I would say I live in the UK, but I dwell in the Caribbean. Hence, the subject matter that I am writing about and I talk about and I reflect seriously on about. So currently, as a retired person, I read a lot. I do some blogging. I'm currently doing some research, continuing my research in the SOAS archives that I'll speak later on. So generally, that's who I am and what I'm about. So I'm from the Caribbean originally, and I live here in Birmingham.
Okay. So could you describe a little about what your chapter's about?
Well, you gave the title of the chapter already, and it's Mission and Whiteness, and Archival Lessons from the London Missionary Society in what was known as British Guiana, what is now Guyana and the Republic of Guyana. And essentially, what I tried to do in the chapter is to interrogate the London Missionary Society, the LMS, and later the Council for World Mission, CWM, their archives, are specifically focusing on the Demerara slave uprising or rebellion of Guyana in 1823. So this year would be 200 years to mark that significant uprising in Guyana. So what I've done in the chapter is to use selected archival sources. And I have drawn from some LMS correspondences, some of the notes, some of the letters that are there, some of the colonial newspapers. So you had the colonial gazettes that are available and full of the documentation and various things in it. And also related publications like people who have written on the Demerara slave rebellion. So I've started with one of the most recent one, Harding's White Death, and then I use others to engage. But it's a selective exploration here in order to look at the role of whiteness and its ongoing legacies in not only the LMS mission narratives, but also in how it continues to be represented in the people who not only wrote in the past or over the years, but are still currently writing. So for me, focusing on that is simply because I find that the archives continue to be a site, a forensic site, like a crime scene.
Yeah.
So it documents lots
you use
of
that
things
title
there.
in your
Yeah.
yeah.
I did use that title and in the piece. So for me, the archival resources remain a critical site in this process of unearthing, amplifying it. So it's not dismissing it, or saying that it's written wrongly or so, but it's just to amplify bits that people would have read differently in terms of rethinking, reframing, and re-engaging with the LMS archives. And I think that this is work in progress. So what I've also said in my presentation, that I'm entering the archives as a Caribbean theologian. I am not saying that I'm not a historian, because I'm a student of history and I love history, but I enter it with a particular set of eyes, mindful of my own ignorance and perhaps complicity in the process as I'm reading retrospectively and rereading this resources, which is housed in an interesting place. It's a good place. SOAS, and SOAS here is in London, but SOAS has been that space that has done much work in terms of research around decolonization and the colonial struggle, and creating a space for people to research colonial archives. So in terms of the chapter, I worked around some orienting questions, and I use orienting questions in the sense that they're not questions that I try to answer, but the questions help me to frame the conversation and to make the argument. So for instance, the question I had in my mind, how did colonial thinking and whiteness inform and frame the endeavor of LMS and its missionaries? Well, I mean, we know the answer to that, but it's more complex and it's not as simple as we would want to answer. What was the overarching view of the LMS and its workers on chattel enslavement and the humanity of the enslaved? And how was such formed in particular sites and events and the interpretive communities and reflected in its communication and mission output? And then also, when you look at the people writing about the event, how was it contested inside and outside of the LMS? And I mean, it's all linked to the ongoing legacies that we are part of in terms of the need to interrogate and to exorcise these ongoing legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. So what I've done in the presentation is to subdivide it into particular headings. And I tend to usually use headings that may grab your attention, but they're also signifying headings. Like, for instance, my introductory bit is blood is everywhere, archives as a crime scene, Then I talked about memorializing the Demerara uprising and using it as a case study in decolonizing, how we can do it and how it is being done. And then looking at the rebellion and the uprising, the one who was perceived as the martyr and who were the rebels, and then the subsequent fallout as a result of what happened. And then also, I found this fascinating book by the Jamaican psychologist that I use. And then in the chapter entitled, in the section entitled Psychology and Psychosis and White Europeans and Post-Colonial Blacks. And then try in the end, to make a case for the ongoing work in terms of what needs to be released and exorcised in terms of whiteness and the ongoing work in the archives. So I think that, I hope that readers would, I don't want readers to necessarily agree with everything I'm writing, nobody would, but to at least engage with what I've written in the chapter. So essentially, that's the gist of it.
There's a lot there to unpack. I mean, maybe you feel like you've touched on this already, but what made you take this particular approach to your chapter?
So I guess a challenge to our decolonial work is the development of new archives and methodologies. Yeah. So if you talk of the producing of knowledge and the new knowledge, so you have the documentation there, but people read it in a particular way. So I think part of the decolonial work is not necessarily only to regurgitate what's already there, but to reread it from particular perspective, to create new knowledge that would then amplify what is there or may have been missed. So it's not about dismissing the archives. So the intention is not to replace the written archive, but rather to complement it, or what some scholars are saying as amplifying it. And I think it builds on some of the work I have done before in Black theology. Like I wrote a thing on the sea's history, drawing a line from Derek Walcott and how, a Caribbean surrounded by water, and then most of our theological articulation tend to be land-based rather than sea-focused. and I asked questions and reimagine what it would be like if you write the story back from the perspective of the sea. And then there was the bit I did about the Methodist history in the Caribbean, where as a male, making my disclaimer there, I reimagine the story being told from the perspective of the 3 slave women who actually did the work, right? Rather than Nathaniel Gilbert in Antigua. And then also my work on Philip Potter, just looking at a different way of doing research and working outside of written material in conversation with other materials and historical stuff that are available. And it's not reflected in this essay, but I built on this essay to write a reflective piece in CWM Insight magazine, where I had Kwamina, the deacon, talking back to Onesimus. So you remember, so CWM has renamed the project from the Legacy, so the Kwamina Project, to the Onesimus Project. And so I used Kwamina as this imagined deacon, a Christian, converted person, as they say in the story here, to now be in conversation with Onesimus to ask the tough question. So for me, the approach is more than reading against the grain of the colonial archives. It's about, unearthing a variety of voices while reading against, so that you have a more kind of broadened or amplified perspective in what's there in the archives and giving agency to other voices. So, because if only scripts that are penned on paper in book form count as evidence for understanding the past, there will be little impetus for my piece, and much more that has to be written, because it actually goes back there and try to work on the stuff and then draw on other things that are available and make the comparisons here. So basically, I think that I felt inclined toward this as a Caribbean person because of the need. As I said, I live in the UK, but I dwell in the Caribbean. And I'm curious also of the fact that the people in Guyana who have written about this story, they tend to follow the dominant view rather than reading against the grain and telling the story from the perspective of the enslaved or Kwamina. So that was the general thrust of my approach.
Thank you.
I mean, there's more that can be done with this, because, for instance, if this story here, one could have gone to one of these free villages in Guyana, as they call them, where they enslaved, lived on these villages that they bought with their own money, and then interview people who would have been familiar with the Kwamina story to hear their perspective, and then work the archives, or provide the archival materials to them and ask them to read it and to say, actually, what is it you can add to tell this story, or how is it you have heard this story, or how has the story been passed on over the years?
Yeah, there's a lot of potential there.
So that's the ongoing work that needs to be done.
Okay, thank you for that. So what would you say has shaped your social conscience, say in regard to race, issues of inclusivity, diversity, etc.?
For me, location matters. I said, that I live in the UK, but I dwell in the Caribbean. So what has really influenced me is my experience as a Caribbean person. So I'm a Guyanese. So Guyana is part of the continent. So it has a large expanse, broad. It's not necessarily an island that just locked and surrounded by water.
Got a particular,
a particular thing. I mean, even though people live along the coast, it's broader than that. In the interior, my ministry was also into the Berbice River, so it's larger perspective. So the Caribbean actually and location has shaped, is a key shaper in terms of my social conscience, my experience, but also it's not only what, but it's who. So for instance, family, I come from a multi-faith background, so Hindu, Muslim, My grandfather, who's a step-grandfather, is of African origin, so who, we really shared the faith, and who was a brilliant engineer, and from whom I learned in the sugar factory. I said, "Oh, you're just a foreman and you're such a brilliant engineer. Why can't you become a factory manager?" A little kid asking him. And he looked at me and he smiled. He said, "Well, the white people just come and they look at the things I am doing." And they said, "What a good job you have done, George." And then they go around and they do the very thing and claim it as their own. So he said that. So quite early from his perspective and from my both Hindu and Muslim grandparents and antecedents, there was a sense of justice. People wanted fair play. So I learned fairness and justice, and my family, my parents would always get into trouble for standing up for when things were wrong. So there is that bit from your family that actually you're upbringing in a kind of a plantation system in which you live on in and around a plantation which is produce sugar, and in a space where you see so many, much poverty, but also lots of injustices, and then growing up in a home where it always had to be just and fair, shaped one consciousness, and in terms of taking on things like issues of race, notions of diversity and inclusivity. Of course, in Guyana, you have racism as well in terms of the kind of legacies with racism, Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese. And then here am I in a family with a Black grandfather and an Indian mother in a totally Indian village. You became very conscious quickly. And that's where I learned about the issue of power and the institutionalizing of racism, rather than seeing it as the bigotry of an individual or the prejudice of an individual. So you quickly realize, and I think that shaped the way I approached the issue when I arrived in the UK, because I have an entry point to also interrogate my own prejudices and the kind of things that within your family you kind of inculcate without even aware of these things. Then, of course, there were people like whom I have read. I mean, if you look at all my writings, I tend to quote theologians, but I also quote a lot of Caribbean people and so on, like C.L.R. James, who wrote The Black Jacobins, the story of the rebellion in Haiti. And in the essay, I then refer to Haiti and an Haitian scholar, talk about historical silence and so on. Caribbean diversity, actually, is something that I'm strong about. And so it's a natural inclination that because of multiple Caribbean impulses, I was able to enter the conversation around diversity with different lens and perspective. And so the strength of the Caribbean is its diversity. And this is why sometimes it irritates me when I understand that the predominant view may be a particular ethnic group, but the Caribbean in its totality is larger than a particular ethnic group. It is its diversity, which is its beauty and its strength. And I think that we can give that greater agency. So part of my undergraduate work, or not undergraduate, postgraduate work, MA work, was theology in Caribbean literature, So I studied Wilson Harris, and I've drawn from different Caribbean writers. I think all of these have influenced my perspectives on issues of race, justice, notions of diversity and inclusivity. Of course, I don't want to give the image that I am this enlightened person from birth. There were many moments of conversion along the road where I had to interrogate my own kind of prejudices or biases and all the kind of bad habits I would have. It has been a learning process.
Thank you. Okay, big question now. What do you think are the biggest challenges that face the church and also the wider society in terms of creating frameworks for social justice?
So let me begin with positively by saying that the church, the church still has a role and can still find a role in terms of modeling what a life flourishing world or society or community can be like. It has still in its toolbox lots of values it can draw on, you know. So that's, I think, the positive. And I think that, to be fair, that the church tries to do and to work towards that end. I think that there are many challenges facing the church. And for me, the first one is integrity. I don't know, but I think that somehow my sense is, which is a limited perspective from a particular tradition that I represent here, and somebody who is not born British, to say, I'm speaking generally. When I say integrity, I mean in the church, there's a tendency to be inclined towards the convergence of interest. If this thing would protect us or ensure our survival, we want to be in support of it. Whereas if the prophetic kind of characteristic or call upon our integrity is that you need to speak and you need to also join the protest or be part of the protest, I'm finding that more and more churches are becoming hesitant. So there's a move towards a convergence of interest with kind of inclination that, yes, we are saying the right things, but in terms of embodying in practice, embodying what the things are towards in our practice, towards justice, I think that we are not always displaying a sense of integrity. So in churches, you find lots of gatekeeping, so that the integrity of the church or the values or the gospel message that the church ought to subscribe to gets compromised. So because integrity is not easily displayed and viewed from those who are outside, what people can see is a sense of denial at times. So one can speak of denial if you think of the transatlantic slave trade, if you think of reparations, if you think of whiteness, if you think of all the kinds of marginalization that are happening. I mean, churches would always tell us that they're the most inclusive space, yet racism happening in it, exclusion happening in it. I've never seen a church notice board which would say that we are like this and everybody welcoming, yet people in it saying that we don't feel welcome. So what actually is happening there? There's something about the integrity which links to trust that is a problem here. And hence what I'm pointing to is this denial as a psychological process in which the painful truth of interrogating who we are is pushed out of an organization's consciousness, and the church is no exemption. So the church can then use this denial as a defense mechanism to protect itself from the truth that it actually should, to confess, ask forgiveness for, and then work towards building this common good that the church dream of. I mean, if you think of something like money, if you're talking about slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, if you're talking about lots of the injustice that are happening around, I think underlying it would be this extractive capitalism that commodify people, commodify groups, take away from. So the church is caught in a bind. How can the church as an organization ask to dethrone the God of economic growth, for instance, when our very well-being, our own well-being and existence are tied to it? Hence, we have to deny it. So in this regard, I think that the church would have to rediscover, and it's a challenge, what it means to be a movement. If you think of the early church starting as a house, as a movement, as not something stuck in an institution, which
Yeah,
then have to
institution.
protect
Yeah.
its interests.
Mm.
And so this brings me to another challenge that the church would face. And when I speak of the church, I'm also speaking of somebody as part of the church, is our inability to discern the shape of the new yet to be born while the old is dying.
Mm.
Lots of things are dying around us, but somehow we are supposed to be a discerning community, but we yet can't discern this, what the shape of this new is going to be like, hence I think this idea of movement is very important, this idea of understanding when we are denying, and also understanding that the world is waiting to believe us. So we need to look again at our integrity, what we preach, what we say, what we write in our statements, and what actually we do in practice, and to see where, there are lots of dissonance. And the last thing I would say here is, of recent, I've read a book called The Good Ancestor by Krasnarik. I mean, it's not a theological book and so on. And I actually agree when, he said that for too long we have behaved like good Samaritans, and we have articulated, the good Samaritan. So if you look at a Christian story about, justice and so on, there's a good Samaritan. You perhaps hear about Zacchaeus and so on, and reparation. And his claim is that rather than, giving more agency to the Good Samaritan, the church need to rediscover, understand, or rethink what it means to be the good ancestor. Okay. And what he means is that they should deploy what indigenous people deploy as the 7-generation principle. So the decision you make now, you should ask the question, how would it impact on 7 generations down the road? Okay. What is it we are doing now in terms of justice that 7 generations down the road, they're going to look back upon us and say, you have been good ancestors because you have handed us over something that is life flourishing, that we can build on, rather than colonizing our future. So I think the church has to break out of this colonizing mode of then colonizing the future for people. So which means lots of our theology we have to revisit and interrogate and look again at. I mean, I can say more, Carol, but
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could.
Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot there. Okay, just to finish, what do you hope people will take from your essay?
Well, to begin with, I hope people can read it through, as they can read, spend time to read through our essays and all the essays in the volume. And if I'm more specific, I can say that perhaps to consider a different way of revisiting the Demerara slave uprising and the possibilities thereof, the spin-off for other archival resources. How then do you reread these archival resources which are there and which now we have made CWM Comfortable Mission with SOAS are making available online for people to digitize, to engage with, but work towards something life flourishing. So it's not only talking, well, this has happened, but reading it again so that we don't make the same mistakes in perpetuating a story that still locks us into a particular way of behaving. I would also think that people would seriously consider delving into the archival materials to do much of the decolonial forensic rereading of these archives. As I've said, as a crime scene, whether forgotten or unforgotten. For me, the past is never dead. I think what Shakespeare said, the past is prologue, it's never dead. It is not even past, It's not. It's an interesting thing that entering in and reading, especially the files on Guyana, British Guiana, and the LMS work there. I'm reading this thing and think, actually, this is not past story because it has reshape my view in terms of how the church is operating there and some of the problems that the society still carry, the legacies that they still carry.
Definitely.
And in this effort of amplifying the archives, I think that we need to consider other methods of doing it. I give you the one example of how you can do research with groups of people. I mean, as a sideway plug, I think I came across this book, Black Rice. Black Rice. For a long time, lots of Caribbean people will tell you, well, rice came with the endangered people to the Caribbean. That's one. Or the colonial people transplanted rice in the Caribbean. Now, what Black Rice has shown is that actually the rice came from Africa. The variety of rice came from Africa. And even stories of enslaved women hiding the grains in their hairs and transporting the rice. So what a Dutch scholar did was to work with the Maroons in Suriname to hear their stories, and then using the grain that they have to do a sort of forensic DNA testing on it that traces it back to Africa rather than the variety of Asia. So I think that there are lots of work to be done in the archive. There are materials there that would, letters, LMS letters, I can tell you about weather, I can tell you about what people eat. In the essay, I spoke about how it was unbelievable for all these enslaved people in the church to be sending back so much money to the LMS. And then that was used actually as one of the charges against the martyr, John Smith, the missionary, because they were saying that, well, actually, you were encouraging them to steal. So they had to steal in order to get money. So, the kind of things you can find in the archives to then reread, because whiteness did not give agency to the fact or couldn't concede that people were creative, people had skills, and people were able to, could produce and do different things. They couldn't see them that way. So I'm hoping that, my piece would then motivate others to take this further. And so I'm hoping that it would inspire people to go and revisit the story, disagree with me, and then do their own piece of research to, give more agency to the voices that need to be heard.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. The fact that there's more to be found out, but there's also to widen the kind of scope of the people that have been doing this kind of work as well. So I think it's an important one, and your piece was a really interesting piece. So thank you, Michael, for your contribution, and we look forward to reading your chapter when the book comes out. Okay. So
thank you, Carol.